Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're still on day one of Cyberweek 2021. We had some great sessions earlier today. Dan, you've done yeoman's work so far today, but appreciate you joining us. I'm very excited about this next session with my mentor, the guy that got me into the dispute resolution field, gave me my first job out of grad school, working at this little website, mediate.com. And let me play around with technology. And Jim, look at all the things you have unleashed, but I know if any of you haven't seen it, Jim hosted a conference last year, Mediation 2020, that's sort of looking at the next 20 years, the 25 years of mediate.com and looking at the next 20 years. And it was a really great conversation. I think many of the topics we're on mind today, I think resonate. Maybe they're not the same, but they rhyme with the topics that we covered last year. But we did a great video which was an interview and testimonials kind of from Jim and John and all the work that they've done in thinking about the role that technology can play in mediation. I can't think of anybody who has done as much to advance the dispute resolution field over the last 25 years as Jim. But we are now going to talk about the next 25 years, Jim. So I'm delighted to be having this conversation with you, and we're eager to open it up and get all of your inputs as well. So Jim, please, what would you like to say to sort of introduce things?
Well, I think the primary thing we accomplished over 25 years was unleashing you, Colin.
For better or for worse?
For better. No, you've kind of been on a sojourn, since 2000. First opening up online resolution and going to eBay and PayPal and Modria and Tyler. And so I feel like we sent you on this educational experience, on somebody else's nickel, and you've now come back home. And as you say, you keep inventing the same business, but just the next generation.
Pretty much, right. The only thing that changes is now we have Meta. Yeah. So maybe this was my sort of my dispute resolution rumspringa, like I think the Amish communities, they send out the young kids to go see the world and then they come back. So, well, at the same time I was talking with you, obviously I was talking with Ethan and having lunch with him at Not Your Average Joe's in Needham, sort of thinking this through. And then Ethan and I together, we went out and met Dan at the National Mediations Board. I remember the first conference I ever attended in dispute resolution was the NAME conference, the National Association of Mediation and Education. I was fresh out of undergrad, and I did a session estimating how many campus mediation programs there were in the country. And the only two people in the room were Bill Waters and Tim Hedin. They were the only two people that showed up for my session. And I was like, I don't know, how many campus mediation programs do you think there are? I kind of made it up, but Bill, so it's wonderful to have all these friends here. And obviously, Jeff, you've been walking this path alongside of us. When did you start ABA Tech Show? What was the first year of Tech Show, Jeff?
Can I just say something totally unrelated?
Please.
But you'll appreciate this. I think you'll appreciate this. Someone told me it this morning. Meta, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
Usually when corporations change their name, they spend billions making sure that the name doesn't mean something negative in another language. Turns out that in Hebrew, meta or meta means death.
Yeah, it's like she died, right? She died. Isn't that hilarious? Yeah. Well, the other thing is metaverse was coined by Neil Stephenson in his book Snow Crash, right? So does he get a royalty check for this? I mean, you figure that somebody, when they renamed Accenture, Anderson Consulting Accenture, somebody got paid like $100 million for coming up with that. I don't know. Hopefully Neil Stephenson gets a free dinner at Applebee's or something for coining these terms. But Jeff, let's just close the loop. When did you start Tech Show?
Well, I believe 1986, we did it at the Infomart in Dallas, and then the World Trade Center in Boston.
Amazing. So look, we got a lot of literal graybeards here on the call to share some of their wisdom with us. But it's not all looking back. We can definitely burn the hour doing that. This session is really about looking forward. And that's what Sharon, we were talking about her practice and kind of mediating to some of these cases online. Jim, I think he has done an effort over the last year, sort of helping us think through what does technology mean to the future of the mediation field, and how do we bring in new practitioners? How do we train them? How do we mentor them? How do we ensure quality? How can we sort of leverage the online opportunity to take mediation to the next level. So I'm tempted to share the slides, Jim, so we can get through them, just so we can start the conversation faster. But do you have anything else you want to say by preface?
Well, I just want to say that, everything kind of changed in March of 2020. And, but that was on top of, really 35 years of development. Initially telling people about email addresses, and eventually the web came along and all the modalities of communication. And the point I would make there is that it was because of all that incremental development that when the pandemic hit and Zoom was such a capable substitute or surrogate for the live meeting, that really the other things, everybody had email and attachments and websites and appointments and getting money. And if they didn't, it was easy for them to get all those other things to go fully online. So there was really a conspiracy of a lot of people working really hard for a long time to get all kinds of functionalities established and familiar. But then we had this, unforeseen and I really think historic mass training event, where not only the professionals in many societies, but the consumers were learning the new Zoom thing. And John Healy had a name for the Zoom thing, which was the Holy Grail. And the question was, when the communication gets so rich and good and smooth and convenient and easy online, we're thinking like the Jetsons, which it's pretty much like these days. Would people really want to get in cars and drive and park and pay and heat and cool and do all those things? And of course, the answer is some. But I think we're seeing, Colin and we have literally data to prove it now, that there are many folks that have been persuaded that a good part of the future is online, and that even if they're going to do the face-to-face, they still should be doing everything right online.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is what Sharon was saying too. I think we were talking about the fact that Zoom is not even controversial anymore. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was an element of, well, how are we going to convince our parties to do this online? But I think we've crossed not only from never to, okay, well, I guess if this is the only option, I guess I'll do it, to now, well, actually, maybe I kind of like this, my parties kind of like it. It's a little more convenient. And now we see technology actually transforming the mediation process. It's changing the way we do our mediation. So we don't block out 2-3 hours and require people to sit there. We may do 30 minutes here, another 15 minutes in the afternoon, and a caucus there, and the next day in the morning. And so, and now I think the interesting thing is, and again, there's some data we're going to share about this, it's turning into the preference, actually, of some mediators and parties. Can't we do this online? Why don't we? Yeah, Sharon, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. So today I got a mediation agreement from another mediator. So I'm representing someone in this mediation as opposed to doing the mediation myself. And there was a whole subsidiary agreement on using Zoom. What are the rules around using Zoom for this mediation? What can you do? What can you not do? How are you going to conduct yourself? What are you promising with respect to who's there with you and what's going on? And it was another 2 pages, and I thought, wow, this is clearly now entrenched, right?
It is, yeah. I know Jim and I, when we did our first online mediation trainings when the pandemic hit, we started to, put out new documents, that had a new agreement to mediate that calls out the responsibilities of the parties when they interact online, because, you do need to be explicit about some of these things, just like you have to be in the ground rules for the mediation. And I know Dan's done amazing work on uniform standards of disclosure too. So I think online mediation gives us opportunities to create new norms around the practice of the field. So that's another opportunity for us to revisit some of these assumptions and make sure we got it right. So, Jim, what did you want to say?
Yeah, and we'll very specifically be talking about that. Of course, we have iCoder in the background, which has really led the way with regard to standard setting for online dispute resolution generally.
Right.
And what we'll be talking about mostly is now taking a really hard look at that, specifically relative to mediation and that slice of it. And I think one of the themes that we find is that identifying understandable, clear, easy to understand, uniform standards are really, I think, going to be the way of the future. And it's a fascinating question to ask, who's best positioned to help lead that way. And I'll give you a hint, which is I think it's international organizations, and we'll come back to that as we move forward. But there's a theme I know. One of the fascinating things about mediation practice and ethical standards is they were all developed, and there was really harmony between ABA and AAA and ACR. Everybody's in harmony, but they were developed at a time when there was no internet. And so it's kind of like you need to reach every single sentence and say, does this still, is it as good as it can be? And so really fascinating time. And of course, there are so few barriers now to the growth. Let me just give one other little factoid that I thought was kind of emblematic of our time. I compared the number of trainings that were listed in the Mediate.com calendar for September of 2019 with September of 21, which just passed. So 2 years difference. Back in 2019, every single training was a face-to-face training. In 2021, there were 3 times as many trainings. Every single one was online. And when it's online, that means there's global access. Without having to get on an airplane, travel, blah, blah, blah. So we really, that has really shown me, Colin, I'll fill in one other piece of data from that NADN study, as I understood it. This was from the end of June, is my recollection, I think June 27th or 29th or the like. And they were asking all the members of NADN, and 700 or so responded. To the extent that you're scheduling cases for 2022, so the upcoming year, to what extent are you scheduling online? To what extent are you scheduling face-to-face? 86% were scheduling online as of the end of June. So just really a sea change in practice.
Well, I want to get into our slides because we're starting to touch on some of those topics, and I want to get through them so that we can open up the discussion. I will say, Jeff, you've been a real leader in terms of understanding that technology was going to create international communities of practice. And I think IBO has been way out in front of that. I think it's interesting too, I remember when I was working at the National Institute for Dispute Resolution in the early 90s, we were setting up these statewide offices of mediation. And there was and that was considered a big standardization push because there was little communities of mediation within each state, but they all had their own rules and they all had their own communities and kind of their own guidelines. So NIDR was working to kind of create, let's create a statewide office that can sort of centralize best practices and maybe share it with areas that don't have a lot of dispute resolution, but also kind of standardize. Well, I think the internet is doing that at just an incredible meta level. I mean, we now have ODR Latino America, we have ODR Africa. We're doing this project in Latvia to help them roll out ODR. You see ODR in Brazil, you see ODR projects in China and in Indonesia. I mean, it's amazing. And the interesting thing is, a lot of these global organizations, like I'm doing a project for the International Standards Organization, they're trying to create best practices and they're utilizing the ICODER standards in APAC, for cross-border small and medium-sized business disputes. You have the European Union ODR regulation looking at what came out of the UNCITRAL ODR working group. I mean, it's amazing to me the degree to which the internet has enabled almost a global conversation around best practices. And I think it's what Dan's leveraging also as well for his uniform disclosure standards. So again, this is a door that's opened for us and we have to figure out how to go through it. And I think there's no question that the door is open now. Everyone agrees with that, but we don't really know what's on the other side yet. So, all right, let me just share some slides here and we can talk through, in essence. All right, let me click the home button. All right, so we're just talking about essentially the future of online mediation and mediation training. And I think we've made this point already. I don't think this is a surprise. ODR is now the new normal. I remember an ABA conference that Dan and Ethan and I went to, and they did a session on Saturday morning about, what's the latest in ODR. And everybody's gone by Saturday morning from the ABA conference. And it was just the 3 of us in a room and we sat around talking. Now I feel like Cyberweek, I mean, we have global conferences about ODR and everyone's asking those same questions, but it's not even the question of it being controversial anymore. As Jim said, this NADN slide, this is another slide from that same report that the National Academy of Distinguished Neutrals did. If you look at this pie chart, they asked their respondents, for the foreseeable future, what's your personal preference? And 371 members, 47%, said mostly online, in person only when the parties insist. And another 325 said mostly in person, but Zoom only when the parties insist. So both are open to online practice. Only 3.6 of the respondents said they were only going to work in person. And then there was 7.4, twice as many, said they were only going to work online. So this is just a pretty shocking turn of events, because before the pandemic, I think these numbers could have been flipped. So this it's a very interesting report. I'm going to post it on mediate.com, all the different slides from this NADN report. But I think this represents a real watershed development in the field. So let me just point out again, these are some quotes that Jim got for the report that we're going to be talking about a little bit. But this notion that this is a big opportunity for us, and this isn't going anywhere. And the question is, how do we best capitalize upon this opportunity to deliver on the goals we have in the mediation field and to further grow online awareness and the effectiveness of online mediation? It's amazing to me. I'm not surprised by the growth in online mediation services, but I am really surprised by the growth in online mediation training. Because as you say, Jim, 2019, I think it would have been a very controversial thing to argue that you were just going to train mediators online with no face-to-face component, and at the end of that, call them mediators. I think a lot of mediation trainers and mediation organizations would say, do they really have the full spectrum? I mean, can you train someone online, even for 40 hours, and then later have them go into a face-to-face room and be confident that they're going to know what they're doing? So I think that there are a lot of unanswered questions. And I think Jim's big contribution, again, working with Woody, they did this online mediation task force. And I'm going to ask Jim to kind of walk through the design of it and sort of what happened with it. But it was all thinking through, getting a lot of the thought leaders in, mostly, I would say, North American, but there were international representatives as well, thinking about where do we go from here in the mediation field. So Jim, do you want to just talk through who was involved and the committees and all of that?
Yeah, again, I just can't say how profound it was back in March when suddenly, really quickly, we had our 2020 conference scheduled the following October. And I was coming up on a 6-month notice date to cancel that reservation if I was going to do it and not get pegged for so much money. And it was that week I was deciding, when we got like 5 cancellations because of the sensitivity to COVID, and things just really flipped overnight. And at that time, that was going to be a conference in Oregon for 150 people. What we ended up having was an online conference with people from like 47 countries and over 500 participants. So that was a quick experience of there's some real opportunity here. So the question was very quickly asked, hey, I'm a young person going in the field. I really just want to practice online. Are you telling me I need to go to a face-to-face training to learn how to do online mediation when that's all I want to do? And I really thought that was the essential issue of the moment, was could people get fully trained online, to offer online mediation services? And are you telling me that they actually need to come to a brick and mortar set of events to learn how to mediate online? Because that's what you're saying. And secondly, the whole game was changing for online training, because now anybody could access anything from anywhere. And in fact, with things like breakout rooms and video, we had greater opportunities for feedback, mentoring, apprenticeships, clinical opportunities online, observation, that there were really unprecedented opportunities now for teaching even face-to-face mediators. How could we best take advantage of the online? So we knew that there was a lot of good thinking out there. The whole purpose of the task force was really to try to consolidate the best thinking that's out there so that we could build off of that as a foundation. And again, this is the world of mediation. We did try to be fairly, although not perfectly, representative of the world of mediation. But I'll add one more nugget, one more puzzle piece to the concept of how we grow this thing. And that is we network with networks. Okay, so an example would be NAFCM, the National Association for Community Mediation. If you read their committee report and their think tank meeting that they had, it's mind-blowing, what they would like to do and the opportunity that they see. So somehow, whatever we're doing, for example, at the international level, we also want to be networking with organizations like NAFCM, because that's how we can really build the snowball. So we had an executive committee. I think there were 11 on that. These were the group that was typically meeting every 2 weeks. We had advisory boards, board members, which were both consultants as well as committee members. I think we have a next slide, Colin, perhaps with all the committees. There were just a lot of committees, and among them, and one we're talking about probably most today is the standards committee. But we had a number of different committees. Each one has its own report. Each one has its own recommendations. And then we've also synthesized all of the recommendations into kind of 8 primary recommendations that we'll be going over.
Yeah, that's the next slide. Yeah, I mean, but also let's talk about the structure of it. So there was an executive committee. I think we met a couple times to sort of come up with the rough plan for the task force. But then there were readouts from each committee, right? So we did a series of Zoom calls, long Zoom calls, to talk through all of the deliberations that occurred within the committee and sort of synthesize their takeaways and best practices, right?
Each committee kind of operated on its own, including things like Zoom calls and drafts and the like. We also had 6 forums, which were open gatherings and really attended by over 1,000 total, which was pretty cool. And really across the board, a variety of issues. You can easily find those. We'll show you the website. So a lot of participation. And again, it wasn't so much to come up with a prescriptive, this is the way to do it, although we did that a little bit. But it was more, what's all the good work that's been done? Let's get it together. Let's consolidate it. And let's talk about now what needs to be done next.
Yeah. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk about each of these 8 in detail. But one of the other things Jim mentioned is ICODER, the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, which is a spin-out membership organization from NCTDR, from the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. And, I think there's been more than a decade of scholarship within the NCTDR fellows thinking about what should be some of the standards that we move forward with online dispute resolution. So these are the ICODER standards, and I know that these are included also in the report, in the online mediation report as well. Yeah, Jim, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, these are actually looking at the ICODER standards and saying how can we make online mediation standards be as consistent as possible with the ICODER, because some of it's not relevant, if you will.
Yeah, I see.
And so that's the intent. And of course, this is just a starting point. I'm sure ICODER standards will evolve, as should these over time. These were recommended in our report, and this is really the one piece that was kind of recommended as a way of getting going in. And Mediate has adopted these. So
that's right.
So and these are different. These would be a part of one of the overall recommendations.
Right. That's right. But it is interesting to follow the same structure as the ICODER standards. I think that does. It synthesizes things. One of the things that I think we've found, and we have a lot of ICODER members here on the call, but one of the things that we found is the scholarship that undergirds these standards, I think, talked a lot about principles, ethical principles. And ethical principles are a little bit higher level. I think the goal for the standards was to summarize some of these principles into something that you could print on a card, potentially you could carry in your wallet and say, this is what. And the other thing we're seeing is we obviously have a lot of practice standards for third-party neutrals, like mediators and arbitrators. That's what the ABA AAA Spider ethical standards were about, was about mediators and arbitrators, sort of what are their ethical obligations. But what we see with the emergence of ODR is these platform designers, the people that are writing the software. You know, we've been thinking a lot at iCoder about, okay, well, don't we need ethical standards for those guys too, especially if we have algorithmic resolutions where the parties are working with a computer program in essence and reaching an agreement. So I think that I like the degree to which the online mediation practice standards resonate with the iCoder ODR standards, because there was a lot of thought put into all of these areas. And again, I think we're going to come back and talk about some of these. You know, one of the hot topics I hear over and over again, it's just a big topic in Silicon Valley, is privacy and security. And the interesting thing is, we don't have a practice standard around privacy. I think the way we talk about it in our field is confidentiality. But confidentiality and privacy are slightly different. And then security, information security, is slightly different as well. So I think this is something that we've always taken our obligation of confidentiality very seriously in the field. But I think we need to expand the concept, not only about keeping confidential information confidential and being clear with our parties about who sees what and how they can use that information that they have, but then also protecting the privacy of personally identifiable information, and then also securing information so that on-off people can't come in and access it, which isn't really much of an issue in face-to-face processes. So let's come back and talk about these a little bit more. But Jim, maybe we can do sort of a walkthrough of, well, I guess do we want to talk about this first, or do we want to go through the key recommendations in detail?
Well, let's back up just a nugget, because, you know, anything that we would do at the kind of uniform or top meta level for all mediation, and you know, this could be a $200 dispute, or it could be a complex divorce or multi-million-dollar commercial case. So, you know, you want to come up with things that are broadly applicable, but different practice areas will have different other standards that they might want to consider. So maybe that next slide, Colin.
Sure.
So this is just an example in the family and divorce area, where, of course, people typically know one another, are very commingled. They've got kids, long-term relationship, both in the past and in the future, et cetera. You know, it make sense for a mediator to discuss how would the folks like to best talk about things. You know, is it face-to-face? Is it online? To what extent each? If it's online, how? And how much of each approach? I mean, the old assumption was, you know, you make it to the office and you sit down, and that takes care of the communicational modalities. But I think different people have different preferences. And to be honest with you, a lot of people were never very comfortable sitting in that brick and mortar room. And so you wonder, would it be a good thing for mediators to seek to elicit information on the front end, how the respective participants would most like to communicate?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that would be a bad thing in our mediation world of self-determination. Secondly, just as an example, if you got kids in the family, how each of the divorcing parents communicates with the non-residential kid is like a massive issue. First of all, wow, what a gift Skype was for move-away parents, you know, who can now actually see their kids on a regular basis. But the access that each parent wants the kid to have as to devices, as to how much time, as to what platforms and what websites and the like. This is actually a critical substantive issue in divorce mediation. And divorce mediation is a little bit different than many areas, because the issues of divorce are, if you will, perfectly predictable. And in that environment, the mediator has a higher ethical issue to be kind of a guide dog for the comprehensive A to Z process. It's actually an ethical duty in most family mediation standards that the mediator assists the participants to reach a comprehensive understanding, not just a barely sufficient understanding, but one that really capably considers the issues. I would suggest to you that online communication with the kids is a massive issue that actually should be a substantive issue. And then finally, might the folks in this long-term relationship, even though they're breaking up very possibly with kids, might they want to have agreements about how they'll communicate in the future so they won't drive each other nuts? and maybe they'll want to take advantage of certain understandings that have worked with others to communicate in respectful and capable ways. So just an example of how different practice areas might have additional consideration of ethical and practice issues.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think on the iCoder website, we also have standards for the use of online dispute resolution and payment disputes. And that's quite a bit different than obviously family and domestic relations mediation. But this notion of these principles, these high-level principles, we've distilled down into a set of standards. And then even beyond those standards, we can sort of have best practices. I think that this is a great framework for if I'm a new mediator and I'm coming in and I'm interested in doing some of these cases, I have to think through these questions. This needs to be included and covered in my training, because without thinking through some of these things, I think you can paint yourself into a corner in a process. And Sharon, that's what you were talking about too, where you saw the additional agreement to mediate that covered sort of the use of Zoom and communication. I think it's very important that we be explicit about these things, because you can't sort of wing it once you get into the process. And it turns out somebody's posting on Facebook about the mediation that they're engaged in, and you go, whoa, you can't do that. Well, where does it say that I can't do that? Well, you need to have an agreement to mediate that calls out these things and positions your mediation for success, because you've addressed these topics in anticipation that they're going to come up. So I think it's going to be interesting to see as we look at other application areas. And Sharon, you're talking about sort of trust and estates kind of things. We should probably have somebody come through and do a similar thing and take a look at these standards and say, okay, how does this work particularly in this application area? Because it's not exactly the same as family and domestic relations. So maybe we could just quickly go through this and then we'll open it up for comments. We already went through the 8 key recommendations, but I think it's useful to just talk through them in a little bit more detail, because I think this is the real contribution. As Jim mentioned, Mediate.com, we have already adopted these standards, and the trainings that we design in the future are going to be based on this as well. I think some other organizations that will go unnamed at this point are also thinking about kind of formally weighing in on this, but this is one that I'm very passionate about: developing online mediation advocacy and resource capacities. If we're thinking about, just like we did at Mediation 2020, the next 20 years of the field, how can we use technology to more effectively advocate and vigorously promote the use of mediation around the world? So Jim, I don't know if you have any comments about this one in particular.
Yeah, I'm doing another presentation I call Mediation's Renaissance, because I think this is a new day. And one of the things I present about is that the selection of an individual mediator is a remarkably conservative decision by the parties. They don't want Bozo the clown. They want somebody who's credible, trustworthy, blah, blah. And so when you see mediators advertising their services on their websites and the like, it's all about trustworthiness and credibility, and inappropriately so. And somehow that the nonprofits in our field have tended to be, of course, the same people. And they also are very good at contemplating things like ethical standards and certification. I call it contemplating the field's navel. Okay. But in the bigger world of business, where we're trying to change things and gain notoriety and visibility and behavioral change, we're competing with MTV and ESPN and Fubo and you name it. We are competing with the entire digital world out there. And so one of the things I'm really promoting about, and we can do it at Mediate.com, because in this case, we're fortunate. We're not a nonprofit. We're for profit, so we can take a little bit more risk and be more creative in trying to develop visibility and impact out there in the bigger world. But this is a discussion I want to have with IMI, for example. This is a discussion I want to have with NAFCM. This is maybe a discussion for iCoder also, because I think it's the organizations in, if you will, that meta position that are positioned to be able to really take the risks to capture people's attention and really change things out there.
Well, and this is something we're talking about doing in the new year, is having a monthly meeting of all of the main organizations promoting mediation around the world, and just kind of figuring out all the ways that we can support each other. I just put a link in the chat to another big takeaway from the Mediation 2020 conference that happened a year ago, which was we need to provide a better pathway to young people to get involved with the field. And of course, young people, if anybody's connected to any young people, they live their lives online. I mean, if you say, well, you got to take a week and go travel to some training and sit in a conference room for 5 days, I mean, that's not going to happen. So I think this youth conference that we had, I mean, I think we had young people from more than 50 countries participate. It's very interesting to think about how technology opens doors to giving access to the field on a pathway that resonates with the younger generation, because they want this to be future oriented. They want to utilize technology in the work that they do.
And this is where some kind of uniform standards or universal standards, Dan, your uniform disclosure would come in so handy, because we also need to run with something that's credible. You know, not only have you noticed us, but now mediate online, and you should do it by these standards, you know, and we just need to get out there, and it's our time.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Well, and I think this one too it's an extension of that, expanding access to online mediation services and online mediation training. So what opportunities does technology give us to open doors? I mean, one of the things that's interesting in mediate.com, I didn't realize this, when you think about how many umpteen thousands of mediators are listed in the platform, once I got a chance to look at the database, well, there's actually like, 13 or 16 states in the United States that don't have any mediators listed in the directory. Now, that doesn't mean that we have every mediator in the world listed in the directory, but it's surprising to me, even where there's so much mediation happening across the country, and it's such a wave of activity, that there are, I don't know, kind of dead areas where we don't have trainings going on, we don't have mediators. I mean, it might be these states are more sparsely populated. Maybe they don't have universities that provide these trainings, or they haven't seeded the community. But it seems to me, because any of us now can deliver services anywhere in the country. You know, if somebody's willing to get on Zoom, I think this really expands access in a meaningful way. And that may mean that those of us who are doing train the trainer type trainings, we can identify some of these geographies and go find people that wouldn't have been able to come to our face-to-face training. I mean, when I think about the ABA Dispute Resolution Section Conference, which is, like, that's one of my favorite conferences. Well, where do those happen? Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Dallas, Houston, maybe Phoenix, maybe Albuquerque. I can't think of one that happened in Fargo. I can't think of one that happened in Boise. Like, there are areas where these meetings don't penetrate, and online gives us huge opportunities to extend the reach, to recruit new people and provide services in areas where they haven't traditionally been easy to access.
Yeah,
Jim, do you want to elaborate on that?
Just that the issue of access has so many different facets to us.
Right.
The young, the old, physical disabilities, mental
cost. Right.
But this is, I have a saying: some mediation is better than no mediation.
Right.
And because people can access it from their home without having to take off work, very possibly without having to get childcare, they just have to get a quiet room for whatever, a half hour or the like. This is where, access in the evenings, access on weekends. There's tremendous opportunity here for us to provide people with some measure of mediation, or to at least discuss the possibility of mediation. That's the biggest change I've noticed in practice. Is now there's a practical tendency, I find, to meet with people individually, if only for 5, 10, or 15 minutes. We just call it an AV call to be sure that the technology is working for them, that if we're doing Zoom, that works, or meetings, or whatever we're doing. And along with that, we have the ability to actually develop a bit of rapport with them, when we're not under the gaze of the other side. And just having that short little kind of quickly getting to know you, let's make sure the technology works, any major concerns right off the bat, just being able to have that, I think is going to become the new model of mediation. And we're not going to do as much stylized law firm conference room opening statements and caucus rooms. It's going to be spread out over time and in ways that are convenient, affordable, and accessible.
Yeah, when Jim and I did our online family mediation training with Claire, one of the things that I started to hear from mediators, which I thought was interesting, was sort of car mediation, because obviously you don't want your spouse or your kids to overhear when you're engaging in one of these processes. So, and they can't necessarily get a quiet room if you're in an apartment or something. So people not driving in the car, they would just go out to the car and then they would sort of put the phone on the dash because they know that it's just them and nobody can hear what they're saying. Like, that's just an amazing thing to think 5 years ago, if you were to say, yeah, people are going to be participating in mediations from their car because they know that that's a secure place to do it. It's just, I think that access, again, in the iCoder context, as Jim mentioned, we talked about access, all the different ramifications of access. It's not just discoverability, it's also cost, it's also complexity, it's also, as Jim mentioned, people with different physical ability levels. So it seems to me technology's ability to radically expand access, that's one of the unparalleled opportunities we've got to think a lot about.
And specifically the issue when there's differential access, one, the best they can do is a choppy phone call, the other one's on a nice new MacBook. What do you do about as a practitioner?
That's right.
And I don't think we resolved that issue.
Yeah. Well, and I think we already talked about this one pretty good, right? This is when we talked about the iCoder ethical standards, but also Jim talked about participant communication preferences and all of that. So the next one, this is Dan's bailiwick, right? Defining a universal online mediator code of disclosure. So Dan, I know you've already done the other two presentations, so I don't want to put too much weight on your shoulders, but do you just want to characterize a little bit about the work that you've done, maybe share the link, and just so that people could learn more? But this is definitely a big component of the takeaways from the task force report.
Sure, and I would say that the work that we started, I've been working with Ana Gonsalves, and what prompted us to start thinking about this was the Singapore conference, the Singapore Convention rollout, and not so much the Singapore Convention specifically, but the notion of the discussion around that conference rollout about the international nature of mediation and the increasing instances of mediation across borders and across cultures. And if you look back, there's been a good bit of research about the various styles. The Schoenvilles did a book in 2012, I think it was, called The Variegated Nature of Mediation. Mm-hmm. They identified about 50 different ways to go about do mediation around the world. And one of the things that occurred to me, and what's what got me started thinking about it, was that there is really only one thing that I could think of, and I've since seen other people say the same thing, that is almost a universal in mediation. Not a universal, but almost. And that is the notion of self-determination, that when you enter into the process of mediation, you ought to enter into it knowing what you're getting into. And increasingly, if you have mediators and parties who are from different cultures and different legal jurisdictions, there is an increasing opportunity for there to be an expectation on the part of the parties or an expectation on the part of the mediator that don't meet. And so we started thinking about, well, what do you do about that? Do you try to formalize the approach to mediation? That's crazy. It's a fool's game. You're never going to do that because there are so many legitimate ways to do it. The other option is to say, okay, are there things that we should be talking about and we should be getting consensus on between the mediator and the parties before the mediation begins, so that I know that when the parties say, yes, as you said, Jim, you don't want a bozo for a mediator, right? So when I say, yeah, Jim, I'm willing to go with you and I understand what you're going to do, I understand the process we're getting into, and I voluntarily say that, yes, I will enter that process with you. That seems to me to be the essence of self-determination on the front end. We tend to talk about self-determination as the ability of the parties to accept or reject a settlement at the end of the process. But my thinking was it actually starts well ahead of that. It starts before we actually get in and we make a decision to say, yes, I'll enter that process. And so that's, I won't take a lot more time, but I will, when I stop talking, I'll post the URL for the website that we put together that sort of lays out what we think after literally having working groups from every continent except Antarctica give us input on what they think ought to be contained in a code of disclosure.
Well, we should consult the penguins as well. They may have an opinion.
Yeah, Well, I wish I could have found somebody from Antarctica. There's a permanent station down there. I could have tried harder.
I'm not sure what their opinion is about universal mediator codes of disclosure, but you're also doing a session during Cyberweek on this, talking.
We are, yeah, and basically what you'll see when you go to the URL is essentially 6 items that, from all of the reports and all of the discussions that we got from around the world, these are the things you really ought to talk about and have consensus on as you start the mediation.
That's great.
They'll change. We're looking at this as an honest standards effort, which is to say that it gets reviewed and changed and improved over time. But that's where we start, and I'll post that as soon as I shut up. I'll post that.
Thank you, Dan. And let's see which one's next. We've got assisting existing mediation programs to renovate their basic mediation trainings and expand online mediation training. So it's funny. I'm here in Fort Worth, and I just had lunch with a judge, and he is in the middle of trying to change the systems in Tarrant County, the court systems, and update and use technology. And I actually think it's a bigger challenge to change an existing system than it is to just start a new system completely from scratch, because there's so much resistance to change. But I think, the point that was raised as part of the task force is, we need to bring along the field. This isn't a matter of, okay, well, let's set up a whole new bunch of online mediation training programs and then just kind of leave the old ones in the dust. I think a lot of what we're trying to do is we're trying to help build a bridge between the way practice happened pre-pandemic and sort of post-pandemic, and then help everybody come along. And I definitely have seen some of the most skilled mediators. I mean, it would take 100 years for me to learn, things they've already discovered in their practice. But wow, they are really put off by the technology, and it kind of sets them on their back heels. So working together to kind of wrap our heads around this to make sure that we bring the field along, I think that was a big aspiration of the task force as well.
Yeah, and I just suggest, that everything has changed. So quickly in the family area, I used to do 2-hour scheduled meetings, and now it would be rare that I would meet beyond 30 minutes. And so all of the previous training about how you do the different things, and I think you're right, Colin. For me, we have a palette. It's text, image, audio, video. There's real time and there's asynchronous. And it's how do we deploy that palette most effectively, right. Along with very potentially some artificial intelligence built in as well. So yeah, pretty fascinating stuff.
Another thing I would say is, and I know I've talked about this with Linda, the dispute resolution professional organizations in the field are finding their role is being changed by technology as well. Because now we can convene a lot of these, like this conference is happening online. Nobody paid $1 for Cyberweek. We have fascinating sessions from all of these authors, So a lot of what the dispute resolution section and SPIDER and ACR and NAME and NCPCR, what they've provided over the past few decades is now happening online. So I think this is very important in terms of new entrants to the field. They can't just buy a ticket to a conference and walk around and rub elbows and meet some people over the wine social, and say, well, what do you do? How can I get involved? I think about mentorship too. It's not an easy thing to break into this field. I remember when I was a wannabe mediator, who do you go talk to? How do you see where this is done? You have to kind of find somebody who's doing it, and and hopefully they'll be nice and invite you in to watch one of their sessions. But we need to replicate that. We need to replicate those pathways, those doorways into the field online, so that we can welcome new practitioners and we can give them the support that they need as they're building their own practice. So that's something we need to think through in a systematic way. All right, we got 3 more here, and then we'll open it up and see what people say. I think this is of a piece with that one that we just talked about, right? Defining and professionally recognizing 100+ hour online and face-to-face mentorship, clinical, and apprenticeship opportunities. I can't think, at Mediate, we're talking about doing a little of this, Jim, but I don't know that anybody has done this before. I'm not sure if there are really good online mentorship, clinical.
Well, this was programs. Michael and Teresa and the like, right. and a lot of them were academic, graduate level academic programs. Mm-hmm. And so we did talk. Obviously, when you're dealing with numbers, it's somewhat arbitrary, but the concept was that if people identify substantial 100+ hour learning opportunities, whether they're internships or mentorships or clinical apprenticeship, you name it. People should be able to be recognized for that. There should be a place to enter that in the database. Also, backing up just one notch, we were trying to come up with a strategy to motivate historically experienced mediators to in fact take an additional training. And so one of the initiatives we discussed was asking trainers if they would be willing to have experienced mediators take part in their 40-hour or whatever number training at a discount price, a half price or the like, simply to motivate them, to get additional training, additional modern renovated training. So this is an extension of it. And boy, I just think we need to totally rethink the training of mediators, particularly providing individual video feedback. Oh my God, that's exactly what people need. So lots of room for growth on this stuff.
Well, and getting them cases too. I mean, I tried for years to get my first cases because there's such a chicken and egg problem. And it wasn't until I got into the grad program at UMass Boston that I got put into a clinical program. And then they took me down to the courts because they got it all worked out. And that was where I did my first small claims mediations. So we need to have that online. We need to have, if people can join an online mediation training, you can't just let them do fish bowls and say, okay, you're a mediator, good luck. I mean, we need to start to give them cases, and those cases exist online too. So.
And Colin, for example, we've seen so much online education evolve to monthly calls with this group or that group. There's no friction, there's no cost, there's no barriers to our online consultation. We'd much rather be there and share a cup of coffee or tea and a bakery good. But my gosh, there's just so few barriers now that we really should take advantage of these opportunities. We got one more.
One more. Okay. And I know we're running out of time, but so this was something, I think it was Michael Leeds, right? He had led some of this effort. He created the Green Pledge for mediators.
John
Sturrock, not Michael Leeds. Sorry, yes, John Sturrock. But and I think Noam Ebner did an article talking about this too. I mean, I think there's, especially with the younger generation, there is a lot of attention around climate change, around carbon emissions. And you think about the legacy way of doing this, not even just having the big building downtown and driving there, but also flying around the world. I mean, I think that the bar is going to be much, much higher moving forward for what's going to require you to get on a plane, what's going to require you to drive downtown. So this notion that online mediation is the green path, we can resolve these cases and minimize our emissions. I think that that's a very important consideration, moving forward, that's going to continue to promote online mediation. So why don't we open it up? I mean, I know we did a lot of talking there, but we wanted to make sure that we shared the report because there was a lot of hands on that in terms of putting that final report together. Let me just surface. I think Bob posted something about, while there are numerous video and conference training classes in mediation, there are very few LMS-based systems that cover mediation. Bob, are you still on? Can you provide a little more clarification to that comment? Maybe we lost Bob. But he also talked about confidentiality and privacy. And I think how we need to get more nuanced in our understanding of confidentiality, privacy, and security so that we can speak to it, because I promise you that is the number one hesitation that many of our parties have about resolving their disputes online. So does anybody else have any comments? I see Sharon posted something. The opposite side of the coin is that mediation is largely unregulated, at least in Canada. So we end up with lawyers acting as mediators, but with no mediator training. Do you want to say something more about that, Sharon? I think that's not just Canada.
Yeah, I didn't think so, but I know here you have, so it is always a difficult balance to make, right? Because litigators acting as mediators, what that results in is the opposite of best practices happening and being perpetuated. And so, that is a difficulty. And I've heard too, you can't really be a mediator unless you've got lots of gray hair. So, you've got to have gone through, it's not a young person's game, right? Which it really shouldn't be that way. I don't know if we've reached the part where it's accepted as a profession in and of itself, as opposed to something tacked on, to law or to some other sort of social environment where people mediate. But
I agree with you 100%, Sharon, in that if we don't consolidate our best practices and build a community where we can mentor new people and bring them in and, ensure they get the experience they need, I think it does open the field to having the lawyers who are much more better organized and credentialed and all those things to sort of come in and say, well, we already have the systems. We've got law schools, we've got trainings. We know that lawyers have gone through this training. So maybe we'll just say you have to be a lawyer in order to be a mediator. And I think that's a step in the wrong direction for the fields. We've worked so hard to create a community of non-lawyer mediators, but we don't have the same infrastructure on the NLM side of the field as the lawyers have on their side.
That's right. But I think the opportunity now is that lawyers don't know how to mediate online. So I think it's quite
Right.
that OGR and AGR are going to become the same thing eventually. And so now's the opportunity because lawyers are trying to figure out how to do this most effectively as well. I mean, the constructs are not entirely ideal, right? It's still a very adversarial system, at least when
Sure.
you're in the context of an adversarial system. If there's litigation going on, lawyers still want to be positional and all of that. So it's a matter of education, which I think we can get at. I have one more question, if you don't mind me taking up too much.
Please, no. We're going to go a little bit over, but yeah, please.
I was wondering if in your experience, you found that certain kinds of cases are not well suited to online resolution. So, like in the basic criminal, for example, like online courts have worked very well. There's some hesitancy with respect to certain kinds of criminal hearings and such. So have you found that in your experience that it doesn't work so well in some kinds of cases?
Well, I'm interested to hear other people's thoughts about this too. When I first started doing ODR, as Jim mentioned, back in the late 90s, early aughts, I had a policy of no family disputes. I just felt like it wasn't a good fit, like family, people have an in-person relationship, there's potential for IPV, intimate partner violence. I felt like it wasn't a good fit. I was more focused on more transactional kind of interactions between strangers, maybe e-commerce purchases, maybe debt collection, something like that. But that was 2000s and things have changed quite a bit. Now we've got iPhones and now we've got social media and somebody told me once it's still creepy that you do online divorces. And I say, well, how do you think people found their spouses? It's all swiping left and swiping right and match.com. It's like the norms have completely changed. So now you have WeDivorce and It's Over Easy and Hello Divorce and Bliss Divorce and amicable.io. I mean, there's all of these online, good divorce companies. So, I guess even my own opinion has changed now. And it's the parties. We actually had an online resolution in my first company that I did back in 2001. I had a no family policy and I had two people who had divorced and they said, look, we're already divorced. We're already separated. We're just trying to figure out asset division. And I said, no, we don't do family stuff. And they're like, why? We don't live in the same place anymore. We've moved. Like, we want to use your tool. Why are you telling us we can't use your tool? And I didn't really have a good answer for them. And now my mind's completely changed on that. I think that maybe the cultural norms have shifted. I think that personal communications where you need an apology, you need a connection. I used to think that technology was not a good thing for that. It was better for that to happen face to face. But I don't know. My tune's changing on that too. Sometimes I find it's easier sometimes for people to have that apology, that moment of forgiveness online, as opposed to being face to face where maybe the emotions get in the way of it. Jim, I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, just in the criminal area, of course, there's victim offender mediation programs where rehabilitation of that relationship is the whole concept. So, but then I'm seeing more and more that you're just having ordinary plea bargaining taking place, often relative to kind of messy murder type cases where there's a psychological thing and relationship, and not always the most progressive places. Idaho, I've seen a number of cases reported where it gets referred for possible mediation of a plea agreement. And I offer that sometimes that's the benefit of mediation. Not all mediation is the same. If you can save the court resources, possibly get a more constructive plea bargain, that's a nice application of the assisted negotiation model also. And that's a point. Mediation is just everywhere, folks. It is everywhere. And the neat thing about it, I think, is it's the only process that really represents a goal of optimized solutions, maximized results, because that's how you get solutions, when everybody gets something and they feel like it's been done as well as it can be done. And the other thing is you get respectful dialogue. And so the combination of respectful dialogue and a search for optimized solutions, it's not even necessarily that you get there. There's literally all kinds of positives just in the search, I would offer. So this is what we need to bring. It's going to have different flavors in different places. But what's the option? How much has to be at issue for a person to go to see a lawyer these days? I think it's multiple thousands of dollars for
more than that. Yeah, potentially.
So why wouldn't you take a crack at an hour of mediation online for a couple $100 if it was readily accessible and seemed safe? So that's what I think the future is.
Well, Jeff made a good point in the chat too, which is, what are kind of the lean forward markets for online dispute resolution? And I think, digital service marketplaces, blockchain assurances of provenance, I think these markets are opening, and I think those are the places that traditionally have been the early adopter for ODR, because I think offline mediation really isn't an option for a lot of those. So, they love ODR because, that's where the dispute arose. So why wouldn't we resolve it in the same environment? Jeff, I don't know if there's anything else you want to share to elaborate on that comment, but I think those kind of emerging markets, that's always been the sweet spot that takes on ODR first. But these legacy markets that I used to have hesitation about, Sharon, slowly but surely my hesitation has been worn down. And it's very hard for me to find any kind of dispute that I can't find some way that technology could benefit it. Maybe not. And I'm not a fan of online versus offline. I think sometimes hybrid is the best. Maybe if you do have an apology, maybe that does need to happen, in person, if you can swing that, or maybe you kick off a dispute, in person, you establish some rapport, and then you move it online, and then most of the progress happens online, and then you get together at the end for the, the final kind of handshake and wrap it up. So I think those hybrid zones are where we're going to live post-pandemic, not all online or all offline.
I used to about an apology. I had a client today who said, I'll give him an apology. I apologize, but I won't mean it. So I said, okay, fine. I'll just hand on the apology and you don't have to mean it.
I've had those. Yeah. Just here's an apology form. It says, I'm sorry because, and then just sign your name on this. The other thing you said was you were talking about gray hair. I will say when I first started doing my mediations and I was in my late 20s, I really felt the lack of gray hair because I was mediating with some older folks and I felt like they had a gravitas I didn't have. Sometimes I would walk in and the parties would look at me and be like, who's this kid? But now that I'm on the older side and I got a lot more gray hair, I miss some of the rapport that you could build with young parties, so the grass is always greener. I think, there's always pluses and minuses. I was mediating in Boston and I didn't have a Boston accent. This guy that I was meeting with had a Boston accent. Boy, did they hit it off with the Boston accent. But I'm down here in Texas now and I grew up in Texas, so I can turn on the Texas. So, we all have our special cocktail that connects us with our parties.
So whether young people can solve young people's problems though, right? Like peer-to-peer mentoring, that sort of thing. I mean, I think that's a whole other arena that could be.
I think it's right. And this is something that Bill and I worked on too, is, sometimes there are disputes that are better resolved by a peer, and sometimes there are disputes that are better resolved by an elder, like a graybeard, like a wise person that's completely disconnected. So, and that's also cultural too. When I was working with Bill, I was talking about, look, a lot of the problems that are rising in campuses, you need to have students coming in to mediate the student disputes, because when the administration gets involved, it's a completely different dynamic. And then there's a knee-jerk reaction, sort of an anti-reaction to any suggestion made by the administration. Whereas if it was a peer, then people be more open to it. But then there are other times when you just need the authority figure to come in and say, look, this is the rule and this is what's going to happen. So that's also a design thing, is who's the right third party.
Colin, really quickly, Claire had the forum for youth dispute. How many countries were represented in that one?
I think she said more than 50 countries.
She said 59 the other day, which is pretty amazing. A little bit paradoxically, the youth and the elder are two of the strongest growing, the folks in homes and facilities, last thing they want to have to do is go somewhere. So if they can get attention to their situation remotely, that's another really rapidly growing area, and the demographics would suggest that will continue.
Yeah, from an access perspective, definitely. Jeff, what did you want to say?
Well, I was very impressed by the youth marketplace work that I saw that you're doing there. As some of you may know, IBO recently brought in an entire youth group called the Global Futurist Initiative. They're located all over the world. Their voices, clearly, the people in their 20s who are just out of college and into graduate programs and so forth, they do not feel that their voices are being heard at all in terms of policy, in terms of issues that are being addressed. And at least to my information in speaking with them and working closely with them, they feel that the people who are involved in policymaking, who are more of the older generations, don't have a clue and aren't acting in the interest of the youth.
Right.
So there is a dispute amongst generations that's boiling up. The idea that these young people are even going to look at legal systems that we have created and spend time in, to me, makes no sense. They're looking for something else. They're not going to be coming to the courts. They're not going to be coming to the legal systems. You built a whole system that if it somehow had been connected to the court system, you never would have had a business grow up out of it. You had to keep it completely outside. That mentality is there over and again. Just a couple of marketplaces. And again, I credit Jim Melamed because I remember him telling me, you're in the business of disputes. You need to understand dispute marketplaces. He told me that 15, 20 years ago. I had no idea what he was talking about. And now I know exactly what he's talking about. This is really like merchant banker time. There are new markets that are being developed. Our program, once we brought in the Global Futurist Initiative, this young group of people, all the things that I've been putting together about building virtual marketplaces, once they took them to literally 2 weeks ago to the IMF, to the major programs, our group was the only one there being represented, and it was about blockchain assurance of provenance for digital identity. And that's a whole area where you can bring in online curation. It's basically looking at documents and helping people be able to make assurances with regard to the trustworthiness of their identity. If you don't have standards in that area, then the entire blockchain is a mess. You need to have, and right now code is law doesn't really mean anything unless there's some universal sets of standards, or you're going to end up with Facebook and Amazon and Google and everybody else setting up their own standards all over again. And then waiting for some nation to regulate it. It doesn't look like that's going to happen as China shuts down, Russia shuts down, India shuts down. There's so many countries shutting down access to their citizens that a global environment needs to be brought forward. And that's what the youth are really good at doing. And to the extent that they listen to what we have to say, this crowd that has been together for 20 years and represented in how many countries? Probably 100 countries around the world. They'll listen and they'll take ideas. So it's really good. I was impressed to see that you connected with the youth, and that's a great thing to continue. Hats off.
Well, you've been ahead of that curve for decades, Jeff, understanding if you think about any successful movement, they have to have a way to get young people and get them excited about it and then have it grow. We don't want to be like the Shakers, where it's like, okay, we got a lot of mediators, but slowly but surely they're dropping off and we're not resupplying. So I think that's what this is all about. Well, I know we're over here. I want to respect everybody's, the rest of everybody's day. Are there any last questions or anything any last comments that anybody would like to make before I hand it to Jim to wrap us up?
I'll just say Friday, if you want to meet the new executive director who's bringing all of this along, and she's in front of the IMF, that's Rachel Svetanoff, and Dan will be interviewing. I'll be part of that, but she'll be presenting a lot of the work that is now being presented before the IMF. And there are ODR opportunities built within it.
Oh, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to that session. Yeah. Any other last comments?
I just offer one, and that is after mediating too many years with real folks, I decided one thing, and that is they really don't need to win. They're just unwilling to lose. And they're particularly unwilling to lose to the demands of, the other side in this dyad.
Right.
And so one of the techniques that works so well is to understand their situation. And then we wonder, hey, folks in similar situations, have sometimes agreed along these lines, or some others will do it this way. And I've seen other people do it this other way. And the concept of normative stories, not directive single stories. But this is what I think the future is going to be, is where computers will help to decipher their situation, figure out what they agree upon, what they don't agree upon. And in some cases say, hey, take a look at these 2 or 3 solutions that have worked for similarly situated others. Let us know whether those might work or whether you'd like to meet with a mediator, right now. So this is how I think mediators are going to work with AI. Intriguingly, whether you're talking to parties, mediators, or courts, they all favor self-determination. The courts don't want a robot deciding every dispute. They feel like it jeopardizes their authority and their jurisdiction, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And in the mediation world, we know that we don't want to take away their ability to decide fully. But we need to be sure that they don't necessarily have to develop everything from scratch. And this is, Colin, from Modria. You can ask them a few questions. You can figure out what might be acceptable and say, would that work? And away we go. So there's a big future of creatively integrating AI with all of this as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Jim always makes fun of me because every time I do a presentation, I always say the same quote from my grandfather that says, don't build your business where the highway is, build your business where the highway is going. And I think the reason why I say it all the time is because it's true. I think we in the field need to think about where all of this is headed. And there are, as disruptive as the last 20 years has been, the next 20 years are going to be even more disruptive. Imagine if Facebook's Meta thing takes off. Imagine, as you say, with AI, imagine if we build a decentralized justice system based on the principles of blockchain and smart contracts. That's going to change everything. And that's why we have to continually update the field to make sure that we're ready. Because if we just keep doing things the way we do it, we're going to have a growing disconnect with where all of this is headed. So, all right, this was a great conversation. I love it. I could do another hour, but I think we need to respect everybody's time here. So I want to thank you, Jim, for my co-presenter, being my co-presenter, for being my mentor, and also for the great work you've done on the task force report. I think it's a huge contribution to the field. And Sharon, thank you for the great questions. Jeff, thanks for piping in. Jeff, thanks for being here. Take care, everybody. Great to see you, and see you at a bunch of other Cyberweek sessions this week. Hopefully you'll be able to join us.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.